Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to life on the North Fork of Long Island. Some are rooted here by generations, others arrived by chance or choice, but all carry with them a piece of the story. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi. For episode 118, we sit down with Lieutenant Colonel Charles Sanders. He has worn many hats: Marine, soldier, real estate agent, town assessor, community leader. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Sanders has served his country across multiple theaters of war, including the Gulf, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo Bay. And he continued that spirit of service here at home, where for over 2 decades he has been a trusted figure in North Fork real estate, a former Southold Town Trustee, and the current commander of American Legion Post 803. In this conversation, we explore the experiences that shaped him from his early days growing up to the reasons he's joined the military, to what those years in uniform taught him about leadership, duty, and community. We also talk about how he brings that perspective to his civilian life, helping residents navigate the often misunderstood world of property assessments and staying involved in the evolving life of the North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 118 with Lieutenant Colonel Charles Sanders. This episode was recorded April 15th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you today.
Thanks a lot, Christopher. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you. And so just in the beginning, could you give a little introduction about yourself, where you grew up, and what were some early influences that shaped your path in life?
Sure. Well, I'm a Midwest boy. I was born in Ohio. My family moved around a lot. We lived in Ohio, then we moved to Michigan, and then Michigan to Florida, Florida to Illinois, and then later in life, after I graduated from high school and college, I came here to New York. The Midwest is a little bit different than New York, but coming here to the North Fork was very similar to the Midwest, because you're not quite in the city.
Yeah.
I've lived a little while in the city, like for 6 or 7 months, and it's a very busy place. Mm-hmm. People are a lot different than they are in the North Fork.
Yes.
So when I came to the North Fork, it was not so much of a culture shock, frankly, but I really did enjoy it. But the Midwest is a great place to grow up.
But just that connection you felt some connection to the North Fork and its character, or the ruralness of the area, or the people.
Yeah, the people were a lot more open-minded, I think. From the Midwest, you can start a conversation and talk very personally with somebody. I did find when I came to New York, some of my initial questions to people probably were a little off-puttish, because we can delve right into someone's private life. In the Midwest, where it's a little bit different in New York, people are a little bit, they're suspect of you initially. They're not sure what kind of a person you are. So when you ask very poignant personal questions, their radar goes off a little bit.
Yes.
A little bit different than the Midwest. People just talk really openly. At least that's the way it was when I grew up in the Midwest. I was born in 1968 in Ohio, and from 68 until, gosh, how old was I? I think I was in my late 20s or early 30s when I moved to New York. So it was a bit different in terms of time growing up in the Midwest versus New York.
And that was kind of after you were in the military did that come later? Because the next question was going to be what led you to join the military?
Well, that kind of goes back to after I graduated from high school, and I went to West Chicago High School in Illinois. After that, I went to junior college. My grades were not really excellent at that time. So I went to junior college, studied very hard, did well in junior college, and transferred to a Christian school called Taylor University in Upland, Indiana. And when I was in Indiana during that time, the Gulf War kicked off. And when I was there, I was studying philosophy and theology. So I was kind of a kid trying to figure out what's the meaning of life. And when the war kicked off, I thought, especially because I was studying theology, I was like, I wonder what God's like under those conditions. And I wonder what life is like under those conditions. So it was during the J term, I think. I left college, joined the Marine Corps, went to boot camp right in the middle of the Gulf War. And the Gulf War was such a quick war that right in the middle of the boot camp in the Marine Corps, the drill instructors came out and they did their normal cocky saying, basically, we came, we kicked ass, and we won the war. But I was already committed for another 6 years in the reserve. So I finished boot camp in 91, late 91. Then I went to another accelerated kind of a Marine Corps infantry school. Mm-hmm. Then I went to motor pool school. I learned how to become a driver for Humvees and trucks and a mechanic. And then I spent my next 4 years in the Marine Corps in the reserve. Never saw war during that time period, never went to combat, never thought I would get back into the military. And I fulfilled my reserve duty. I think it was around 94, 96, I was done with my commitment to the Marine Corps, and then I got out.
And how was that? Because you were in the Marines and the Army National Guard.
Now, currently, I'm a lieutenant colonel in the New York Army National Guard with the 42nd Infantry Division. Just about to go on my 4th deployment. This time, I'll be going to Kuwait. But there was a long, huge, very long break in service between my time in the Marine Corps and then my time to get back into the National Guard. That kind of transitions really well into my real estate. When I came out to the North Fork, I was just a house painter. I literally came to the North Fork with $100 in a pickup truck. And I'm not exaggerating. I painted houses in the Midwest while I was working my way through college, finishing my Marine Corps duty. So I learned that skill. And I came out here to the North Fork for one summer. A buddy of mine lived in the old building now occupied by the woodworking company right next to the library in Southold on Travelers Street. The big yellow, it's a big yellow building now, right next to the Southold library. I guess it used to be our old post office, and it was moved to that location and then converted into a residential apartments. Mm-hmm. So when I came out here for the summer, a buddy of mine, he lived in New Jersey. His name is Steve Nelson, really good, close friend of mine. He lives in New Jersey, and he would come out here in summer all his life. Well, this particular summer, he said, dude, come on out, hang out with me on the North Fork. I think you'll love the place. It had everything I loved. I mean, it had water. Mm-hmm. We would go and grab local lobsters. We would cook lobsters and corn on the weekend and hit the beaches all the time. So it was a wonderful time. But that particular house had 3 different units. 2 units were not done, and 1 unit was where we were living at that time period. So I became a friend with the guy who I thought owned it, but he didn't own it. He kind of like managed it. Mm-hmm. So I fell in love with the North Fork and said, you know what, I really think when I go back home to Illinois, I might think about coming back and moving here. So I contemplated it. I decided, I'm going to do it. So I contacted him. My buddy Steve went back to Illinois. I went back to Illinois. The summer was over. It was a great time. So I kept in contact with the guy who owned it. And I said, I'll come in and I'll paint the building for like free rent so I could live there. Mm-hmm. He said, that's a great idea. So when I finally made my mind up to do it, I literally packed up my pickup truck with everything I owned, including my ladders, And I told him before I came out there, is everything ready? Is it good to go? He said, quite frankly, he said, yes, everything is there. Everything is ready. I should have asked him a couple more questions, because when I arrived, and this was during the time I think the Long Island Expressway was being worked on. So I had already traveled a long distance. Before I even left Illinois, I felt that the God was against me, because I had a flat tire. I had to get my tire fixed because I had so much weight on the truck. Had to get the tire fixed. Finally got it fixed. I'm thinking, what am I doing? Should I really be making this move to Illinois? I'm uprooting my entire life, coming out here solo to the North Fork. I just said, I'm doing it. I'm going for it. So I did it, finally arrived. He was 100% correct. Everything was there, but not everything was installed. That one initial apartment that I had lived in, which was there and had everything, was rented. The front apartment and the back apartment were being worked on. Oh no, the middle, actually, correction. The front apartment is where we lived. The middle apartment was being worked on as a studio apartment. And the back apartment, one bedroom, I think, was being worked on too.
Okay.
So none of it was done. I literally had a toilet, not a kitchen, nothing. Everything was there, nothing was installed.
Wow.
And I'd already moved my entire life there. I panicked, actually. I had a moment of panic for that first time I arrived to the North Fork. After a couple of crosswords with the guy who owned it, I decided I'm not going to give up. I ended up just organizing the place and started renovating it really on my own to make an apartment. And slowly but surely, I made contact with people who wanted their houses painted and just started painting houses on the North Fork.
And then how did you get involved with the real estate? Did that come in later?
I think it was around 1991, and I'm not sure exactly how old I was. We'll have to do the math. But I think I was in my 30s looking at my life going, I don't want to paint houses the rest of my life. I need to transition. I had a college degree. I needed to transition to something that would be long-term. Once you reach your 30s, if you don't start thinking about, what your life's going to be like in your 40s or 50s, before you know it, you're going to be broke. So luckily, I met Bob Scalia, who owned Century 21 here on the North Fork. His son, Tom Scalia, still owns it. And I said, I'm going to get my real estate license. Will you sponsor me? I got my real estate license, came in right in 91, which was really an ideal time to get into real estate, because that's right when the North Fork, I think that I would consider that the North Fork's first discovery, because the market began to expand quite dramatically. Homes began to increase in value. It was already after they had converted to the 2-acre zoning, so that artificially raised everyone's value. It made the homes, it made it more difficult to have high density housing. So that means everyone else's homes are going to be automatically, inflated.
Yeah.
And we're driven by the people from the city coming in. So slowly but surely started making real estate sales plus painting houses. It's really hard to go cold turkey into real estate because it's it's commission based. You're not going to make a lot of money that first year unless you really hit the market well. And slowly I was able to transition from painting to full-time real estate from 91 to 91 all the way until I became an associate broker, and I moved out of Century 21 and went to a couple of other smaller agencies and just began to grow my business that way. And
what were some of the, obviously it's been over 2 decades of working in the market. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen in the area?
I think some of the primary changes are demographics and the actual value of homes. It's incredible how the market has just exploded.
What was kind of the average price for a medium-sized home in the 90s?
When you could get, I think I bought my first starter home for like $130,000, but the average homes were in the high 200s, mid 3s. Now you can't even get a piece of land for that. If you're lucky, you can get a piece of land.
Yeah.
But if I only, like everyone says this, but if I only knew what I knew now, I would have been a lot savvier in terms of buying real estate, flipping, buying more real estate, and kind of walking up the market that way. But it's just amazing.
Yeah, I think people started to do that even in Greenport, whether people that were moving out here in even the late 80s into the 90s, because I think there were abandoned places here for like 13,000, or because I think Greenport was a little different at that time from Southold or Mattituck in terms of I think it was struggling a little bit more, coming back from being a little bit more empty, some of the storefronts in the area at that time. But it's interesting, you don't really know at the time what's a good time to buy.
No, I mean, that's the whole thing. You'd have to be a soothsayer or a wizard of some sort to be able to do that.
Yeah.
The Greenport was, before, I mean, when I started selling real estate in the 90s, it was okay. It was really on an upturn. Mm-hmm. Mayor Capel was the mayor. Mm-hmm. He was doing a lot of downtown renovation, doing a great job as a mayor, really bringing the village back to its original, original grandeur. But now that I'm the assessor, I know I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit, but the only reason I'm mentioning being an assessor is you'll notice that the village of Greenport, a lot of the properties had what's called a depreciation on them. So their assessed value was depreciated, or it was reduced to give those homeowners a break on their taxes because it was so devastated back in the 80s and I think 70s and 80s, honestly. Yeah. Section 8 was pretty heavy. It was really hard to even sell a home. Mm-hmm. So you'll find a lot of homes in the village, even some of them still have those depreciations on them, even though they're not merited per se. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the village has dramatically changed. So to kind of circle back to your original question, the medium price 400s were a higher end home. Waterfronts were under $1 million. It was like unheard of to hear things selling in waterfronts for $3 and $4 million back at that time. Yeah. And then it just skyrocketed from there, especially during COVID in 2020.
Yes. And then could you talk a little bit how you got involved with public service, serving as a Southold Town Trustee, and then leading the American Legion Post 803?
Sure. A lot of those activities stemmed from the 2008 real estate crash or financial crisis that happened. By 2006, 7, and 8, I had started my own real estate office right down Bootleg Alley in the village of Greenport. I had worked with other brokers for years. I, was just a salesperson, and then I became an associate broker. And then thinking I could do it on my own, I said, you know what, I'm going to try to open up my own office. But I did something a little bit different than other agencies. What I did is I had a retail store / real estate office. And I did that on purpose. I had one of my first waterfront sales was to a guy who owned what was Oneida Tableware. And he sold Oneida Tableware right before 9/11. Made a boatload of money. I came out here and bought a waterfront house. And he was involved in that world of culinary, like spoons and knives and cutlery and things of that nature. So that's how he got the relationship with the airlines and Oneida. So he had that big contract. Mm-hmm. Well, he introduced me to the owners of what was called Fish's Eddy in the city. Fish's Eddy is this really cool store near Union Square where they have all these crazy wild dishes. Okay. So what I was able to do is buy some of their dishes, bring them out here to the North Fork, sell that, and do kind of a consignment thing all at the same time. Mm-hmm. So that sounds like, what are you doing? You can't figure out what you want to do. Do you want to be a retail store or do you want to be a real estate agent? Well, back then, who was the primary market for somebody who buy a home on the North Fork? Who do you think is the primary person that's coming out here to buy homes on the North Fork?
You mean from the city part?
Exactly. They're all from the city. They come out, and what do they do when they come out to the North Fork? They shop.
Shop to put things in their house.
That's exactly what they want to do.
Yeah.
So they go down Bootleg Alley, this cute little bootleg alley. Then they'll come into my shop and they'll see in the windows all these real estate ads. Then what does that do? All you need to do is spark a conversation. If you're able to spark a conversation with somebody, that's how you're able to convince them, hey, working with me, an independent broker, is more conducive than working for a larger broker. I was part of multiple listing service. I was able to have more maneuvering capabilities for my commission. So somebody who was buying a home or listing their home, if I bump down my commission by 2 points, it's an enormous savings for somebody. So sitting down with them and talking to them about that, my business began to explode. And I primarily focused on selling, because if you're able to sell homes, like list them, what I mean by that is really list versus the buyer side, you're able to concentrate more of your time on serving your client and less time kicking tires. Because the majority of people that you're putting in your car, they're not going to buy. So you're spending an enormous amount of your energy just driving people around. So I focused on that, started doing really well, was making a decent living in it. And then the 2008 crash happened. And I was a guy who was in his late 30s at this time. And I put all my eggs in one basket. And it was that store, and it was real estate. And if you're going to have a midlife crisis, that's the time to have a midlife crisis. Just imagine that. You're almost turning 40 and you've pretty much lost everything at that time. Yeah. It got to the point where I was so scared that I was going to lose my home. So I know that's a long way to kind of try to answer your question. But in 2008, I thought, okay, how do I survive? How do I keep going with this real estate business, the store? So I started looking in, well, maybe if I supplement my income like I did when I was younger in the Marine Corps Reserve, I could do that. So I began to look into it. And it was right during the time, 2008, we were still in Afghanistan. It was in the height of the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq as well. So I went to the Marine Corps recruiter. I sat down with the Marine Corps recruiter. Because I had a college degree and I'd always wanted to become an officer, I thought to myself, okay, I'm not going to go the enlisted route. I'm going to go try to become an officer. So I sat down, and the recruiter was excited because I was not somebody he had to convince to become a Marine officer. I'd already made up my mind I wanted to do it. So we started filling out the paperwork. He said, where do you live? I live in Greenport. What is your address? I gave him my address. Gave me height, weight, all that stuff. We went through that. And then he goes, what's your date of birth? And when I told him 1968, he looked up at me. He goes, what are you, crazy? Like, you're almost 40 years old. There's no way the Marine Corps is going to take you as an officer. It didn't dawn on me that I was too old to become an officer in the Marine Corps. So I was very disappointed, but I wasn't dissuaded from going back into the military. So I started doing more research and found that the New York Army National Guard had a waiver at the time because they were really hard up for new officers and people to fill the ranks so that they could fill the people that are deploying to Afghanistan and to Iraq. So I was able to do an accelerated officer candidate school. At the age of 39, I had to graduate before I was 40, or I would stay an enlisted person. So I went to Fort McClellan Accelerated Officer Candidate School, which was like, really, honestly, it was like going back to boot camp. It was very stressful. And I was worried I wasn't even going to be able to get through it. But fortunately, I worked out very hard, got in very good, excellent physical condition, was able to graduate the school right as I turned 40, was commissioned as a lieutenant, and was attached to the Fighting 69th in New York City. But then I had to go to my basic school as an officer.
Yes.
Back in 2008. Again, it's kind of circling around how I got involved in to become a trustee. But if it wasn't for that time in 2008 when the crash happened, where I had to I had to pivot and find another, an avenue to keep me, alive, really financially. But I found when I was away on duty that I thought I was getting paid too much. I thought there was some sort of mistake on my paycheck. So I went to the admin officer and I go, wait a minute, what is this thing BHA, Basic Housing Allowance? And when you're in the New York Army National Guard and you own a home, you'll get an allowance to help supplement the fact that you own a home. Well, that plus my normal pay was keeping me afloat dramatically. So when I got out of I became, commissioned officer, that's when I started contemplating potentially, going full time back into the military, or at least full time in the National Guard. So I had to fold up my real estate office. I realized that the market wasn't changing. It was a really, really tough time to be a real estate broker. And I was back full time in the National Guard to go through infantry school. So I went through infantry school at 40, turned 41, went to airborne school, air assault school, graduated those schools, and then was back at the Fighting 69th. I think all that was done by 2009. And then 2010, they had been, that the Fighting 69th was returning from one of their deployments, and I was a young lieutenant. And they all had patches, meaning they deployed, and I didn't deploy. I felt really insecure about that. And another deployment in 2010 in Afghanistan popped up with I'm forgetting the name of the unit all of a sudden, the CAV in Vermont, 217th CAV in Vermont. So I volunteered to go on that deployment in 2010, and I went to Afghanistan in 2010, came back, went on active orders for 2011 and volunteered to go back to Afghanistan in 2012. Went back in 2012 and then came back after that from that deployment. And then I think it was 2014, I was trying to transition kind of back into a normal civilian life. And that's when I looked into actually trying to become the assessor during that time. I think it was 2014. But they had already chosen candidates for the assessor position, and they offered me the trustee position and said, would you like to run for trustee? So I began to, I love the water. I love boating and scuba diving and doing all those things. So I thought, this would be a great, I didn't scuba dive at that time, but I did a little later. But
yeah. I was curious, even, I don't know if you wanted to talk about it, but even during your deployment, were there any particular moments throughout your military career that stand out to you, even from those deployments in Afghanistan? Or did you go to Guantanamo Bay?
Yes, I did go to Guantanamo Bay in 2015.
Okay.
After I had successfully run for office for town trustee. So I ran for office in town for a trustee, won that election, and then I was attached to a unit that was deploying. The division was deploying to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, it's very interesting to think. In 2010, when I deployed to Afghanistan, I wasn't a young lieutenant. I was kind of an older lieutenant, but I was young in terms of my knowledge of, why in the hell were we in Afghanistan? I mean, everybody understood 9/11, but do they truly understand the purpose of us going to Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden and his background and how that actually transitions all the way back to the Gulf War?
Yes.
When I was in the Marine Corps back in the Gulf War, that's when he began to be very angry at the Americans because, we had bases in Saudi Arabia and we were basically, to him, that disgusted him. That for the infidels to be in Saudi land was just, horrifying to him in many ways, even though we assisted he and the Taliban during the time to knock out the Russians when they were in Afghanistan.
Yes.
Which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But what stands out to me is, this youngish lieutenant not really understanding why he was in Afghanistan. And then I studied up quite a bit while I was there, experienced what it was like to be in war during that time period. Fortunately, never had to shoot my weapon or see anybody get killed. I was very, very fortunate in 2010, as well as 2012. But then to go to 2015, to go to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to see some of the masterminds of 9/11 there in the courtroom. I was able to visit the courtroom while some of the proceedings were occurring with the detainees there. It was like a 180. Here you are seeing the war play out. I was in New York when 9/11 happened, not in the city. I was here in the village of Greenport.
Okay.
But here I'm in New York. 9/11 happens, and I find myself in the National Guard, in Afghanistan twice, and then Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Kind of seeing all of that pan out was very fascinating, and it helped. The military helped me dramatically grow up and mature, for sure. And you see a lot of, you're required to grow up quite quickly when your life is on the line, and the people around you, their lives are on the line too.
Yes. Also, could you talk a little bit about joining the American Legion post?
Sure.
803.
I joined just as a normal member. I really didn't understand what the American Legion was, so I took an American Legion course that they have. It's a little, you get these little booklets and you read about the history of the post, or not just the post, of the American Legion. And a lot of people don't realize how important the American Legion is. After World War I, we didn't have the VA. People came back banged up, wounded. They called it shell shock back then. Some people had horrible scars on their faces, limbs missing. And there was no structure. There was no real medical organization or facility that took care of veterans. Back then, and you could even, if you were a wealthy person, you could even start your own regiment, for crying out loud, and go over and fight. Well, at least that was very, very true during the Civil War. But after World War I, there was no organization that took care of veterans. So a group of officers and enlisted formed the American Legion after 1919, I think it was, with the primary goals, with 4 pillars of the American Legion, to focus on those pillars, to help veterans and help those recovering after. And the American Legion also had a big role in the development of the VA system that we have now. You know, they went to Congress, they lobbied for Congress to create some sort of medical facilities and you know, to help veterans, and they were a part of it. So the 4 pillars of the American Legion, hopefully I'll remember them off the top of my head. Veteran affairs, Americanism, supporting Americanism. Never quite understood what that meant when I first joined, but it's really an understanding of the love of your country, of patriotism, understanding America's history, and supporting those values. Child and youth services, working with kids, especially those children of veterans, and national defense. Assisting with national defense. Those 4 pillars surround the American Legion and what its purpose is. So when I joined just as a normal member, became the historian for a couple of years, and then I became the commander. And then as the commander, that's when I really focused on those pillars, and really focused on how to drive the team to focus around those pillars, to keep the American Legion alive here on the North Fork, because the demographics changed. World War II, we had 12 million people serving, for crying out loud. So the legions were flush with people.
With people joining, and
tons of people joining. Then you had the Korean War. Tons of people joined after the Korean War. Vietnam War, that's another story. You had a lot of people that came back from the Vietnam War. They weren't treated well. They weren't even treated well at the Legion. There was such bad publicity and press around those guys that even guys that were Legionnaires kind of pushed those guys away, instead of doing what they should have done, is, rallying around them and supporting them. Yes. So it took a while for the Vietnam veterans to get involved. So I took real specific notice of them and honored them as much as I possibly can as commander. But fortunately, I was the commander for 7 years, and we kept it alive. We kept it striving. We kept we kept the numbers up around 200, and we provide the 4th of July parade, the Memorial Day service, flag remembrance. We support the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts at no cost to them. They can use our facilities for free. Mm-hmm. Those are all things that the American Legion does to give back to the community.
Yes. No, it's important. And even I know the Greenport one does a lot too for the Greenport Legion. But then in terms of your assessor job, could you talk a little bit about that job for people that might not know what it is?
No, I'm glad you asked for that. So after serving as town trustee for one term, I successfully ran for assessor for the first term, and then I won again. So mm-hmm. this going into 2025, I'll be running again for a town assessor. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I'll be deploying again this time to the Middle East, to Kuwait. But a town assessor really needs to have a real estate background. Mm-hmm. If you have no real estate background and you're running for town assessor, then that's not a really good thing, unless you have an excellent background in like banking or appraisal or something of that nature. Mm-hmm. So what the town assessor does is, in essence, we assess the homes on the North Fork and properties on the North Fork uniformly, so that we can come up with an assessed value for your property. And that assessed value, if you take out your tax bill, which is, quite frankly, until I became assessor, it was hard for me to even read that darn tax bill. Mm-hmm. But you'll find on the tax bill a thing called your AV, your assessed value. And then you'll see what is called full value. So you look at that tax bill, you say, for example, the full value is $1,500,000. Well, that $1,500,000 is derived from your assessment and what's called the residential assessment ratio, which is derived from New York State. They come out with that ratio mm-hmm. for homeowners to help them understand, hey, New York State's looking at your property and saying your house is worth $1.5 million. Mm-hmm. So you look at that assessment that we derive, mm-hmm. and we use a brick and mortar, because we don't reassess every property. There's like 18,327 properties on the North Fork. We don't reassess every one of those every year. Mm-hmm. Assessment is changed by somebody adding on to their home, or a brand new home comes on the market. We assess it using a brick and mortar procedure, which are like just rates for how much your square footage is for your first floor, your second mm-hmm. floor, your AC, if you have a pool. Then that gives you your assessed value. New York State gives you that RAR, and then you have your full value. And you look at that full value and you go, hey, everybody in my neighborhood looks like me. My house is $1.5 million. You're telling me it's $1.5 million, but it's only everybody else is selling for $500,000. Mm-hmm. That's when you can come to the assessor and go, hey, sir, I'm overassessed. New York State says I'm $1.5 million. Your assessment has me at $1.5 million. Here's my evidence that my house should be less. You provide us that evidence. We're able to modify your assessment, which translates directly into your taxes.
Yes.
So your assessed value, say for example, your assessed value comes out to $4,000. You multiply that times your tax rate in what town you're in. We're in the village of Greenport right now. So off the top of my head, I think our assessed value per 1,000 is $1,740. So we'll do a little math real quick.
Sure.
So let me grab my calculator. So we've got a house that's right now, the full value on your tax bill says $2 million. All right. So let's find out what the assessment would be. So we multiply that by 0.0055. So if you look at your property card, you'll see an assessed value of 11,000. Well, if you live in Greenport, that 11,000 is 11 1,000s. Mm-hmm. Just round it up. Let's just say 11 times $1,740. Your taxes would be $19,140 per mm-hmm. year, without any exemptions or without any of that at all.
Yeah.
So kind of circling back to what we had talked about earlier, if you look at that full value, we were saying $1.5 million. Now $1.5 million is kind of a normal number. But just for giggles, let's say you have a $2 million house and everybody in the neighborhood selling for $1.5 million. You potentially could be overassessed $500,000. You provide us evidence. I can reduce it down to that, potentially down to that $1.5 million. Then you would save. That would be a big savings, actually. So let's say we had $2 million. Now it's down to $1,500,000. Let's go back to that. $1 million. We'll do $1,500,000. $1,500,000. We were at $2 million. $1,500,000 times 0.0055. So now your assessment went down from 11,000 to 8,250. So that's 8 times 1,740, I think, if I'm remembering it right. So now it went from like 19,000 to 13,900 bucks. So it's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So I say all that to say this: if you don't have an understanding of how to assess a property and how to properly evaluate it, then you could really do a disservice to the town. So that's why it's really important, whenever party, Republican or Democrat, puts a person up to run for assessor, they should have a background in real estate or a background that can articulate what I just said. Otherwise, you're going to go in green. And New York State requires, I think it was 40 plus. I don't remember all the courses that I had to take, even though I had a real estate background. There's a plethora of appraisal classes that you'll have to go through, learning about appraising farmland, commercial properties, residential properties, in order to be certified as an assessor in New York State. And I'm fully qualified to serve as an assessor in New York State because I successfully completed all of those courses in my first term, versus anybody running against me this time, obviously, unless they were a former assessor, the town's going to have to pay them to go through all those courses, learn all of that again, and then become an assessor.
Yes. And then you've explained the process of the property assessment, but how does that impact the local taxpayers more so? I think you talked about that a bit. Well, but just that whole process.
That whole process dramatically impacts everybody on the North Fork, but especially, say, I have a lot of people that there's a lot of new construction that's going on the North Fork. And you'll be surprised how many people build a home and never call us until they get their bill. And they're shocked. They get their bill, and they're shocked by how much they're paying in taxes. And all they could have done is call us, give us the square footage of the property, and I can give them an idea of what their assessment's going to be like by doing that math that I just gave you a couple of minutes ago. And they'll have an idea. Okay, I'm going to build a 3,000 square foot ranch or a 4,000 square foot house. How is that going to translate? Well, now that means I'm going to be paying $19,000 in taxes potentially. Well, I can afford 15. Well, okay, Charles, can you help me develop and design a house that would get me into that bracket potentially, so I can be in a $15,000 tax bracket? And I would go, yes. However, I could only do it for this year because the tax rates continue to go up. Assessors have nothing to do with the tax rate.
Yes. You just work with what you have.
We just implement New York State law. That's why it's really, our position is nonpartisan. We don't set policy. We execute law, and we execute the math, and that's it.
Yes. So just looking back at your career from military service to real estate to public office, how do you balance all these responsibilities? And what advice do you have for others looking to manage multiple roles in their lives?
I think one of the greatest things I've gleaned from being in the military is discipline. Discipline is driven into you from boot camp all the way through your entire military career. You show up on time, if not early. You always show up early. If I'm supposed to be somewhere at 5 o'clock, that means I need to be there at 4:45. You know, you're generally speaking. I mean, it's different when you have a civilian job. That world is a lot different than the military. But the discipline aspect is important for me. I think this is just part of my nature, but the military definitely has helped me with this as a planner. I have an analog planning map that I use and my phone as a digital planning tool, but I manage everything I do from day to day, week to week, month to month, and yearly. And then I set yearly goals every year, what I want to try to accomplish for that year. And by doing that ahead of time, prior to the year's execution, you're able to manage your time better, and you're able to balance that. And fortunately, the assessing job and the military career marry each other very well. There's flexibility within the assessor's job that allows me to go away to execute my military service when I have to do that on the weekends, and the time I have to go for the 2 weeks plus. But it is a little bit of a burden when I go away on my deployment. It is going to be extra work for those who are going to be the assessor while I'm gone. But when I return, I'll be able to pick up the slack from the time on which I was gone. But the great thing about being in the military, and New York state law allows that as well. So if I were a fireman or a policeman or in any of those positions, you're able to go on a deployment and still retain your job. However, because I'm a public official, meaning I had to run for office, there's a chance that because the Democrats are running candidates against myself and the open seat now that Kevin Webster is departing, that I could come back from my deployment without a job.
But in terms of you mentioned some other goals moving forward, but as you continue to serve your community, what's one thing you hope to accomplish in the next few years within your time in Southold?
Well, within my time, I'll say within my military career, which will translate into my time in the town of Southold. I'm a lieutenant colonel now, and I can't really go any higher without a major waiver because of my age. If you remember my earlier discussion, I got back into the military as an officer quite late in my life. So I'm almost 60. So when I'm 60, that's my mandatory retirement date. So I'm 57 now. I'll be 58 when I return from my deployment. And then I'll only have about 2 more years that I can serve, and then I'll be done with my military career. And that will end the chapter, a pretty great chapter of my life. And then, God willing, if I come back to a job, so please vote for me. If I come back to a job, then I'll continue with being the town assessor.
Yes.
Unless there's something else that pops up in my head for higher office, or I haven't really thought that much about that because I'm very comfortable in the assessor's office. And I think after my retirement from the military, it's going to be nice to be able to take a breather.
Yes.
From trying to juggle. I mean, at one time I was juggling being an assessor, the commander of the American Legion, and military.
Yes.
So
that's a lot.
Once I was able to complete my time as the commander of the Legion, I just had the assessor and military. So now when the military's done, I'll have a lot more time that I could spend, and I'll have to figure that out.
Yes.
When I'm 60.
And then also just being out here, moving out here, and then being out here even today, what have you enjoyed most about living and working on the North Fork?
What I've enjoyed most, I think, is the people. I get a lot of phone calls from people that are dealing with the assessor's office going, what? You answered the phone. Anybody who lives up island or in the city, you're not talking to an assessor. So it's pretty cool to be able to directly talk to the homeowner. And they love it because they don't have to wait hours to hear back from us. They can call us, and if we're in the office, they're going to talk to us right away. So that direct dialogue, and that's another thing I really enjoyed as a real estate broker as well, is just meeting new people, interacting with them, being a part of the Legion and working with veterans and seeing how how their lives have panned out and talking to them about their lives, especially during the time in war. We had some guys that served in the Korean War, and what they saw was incredible. Unfortunately, very few World War II veterans are still alive, but I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Pittman, who lived to 104. I think he passed away just last year or 2 years ago. And I'll give you a quick funny story about Dr. Pittman.
Yeah.
He came to the American Legion when I was in my office. I happened to be there when he came in. And he was really excited. He said, "I want to march in the 4th of July parade." And I'm like, "No problem. We'll get a car for you. We'll put a banner." And he looked at me like, "No, I literally want to march." So I'm like, "You're 100 years old." He said, "I want to march." Mm-hmm. He marched in every 4th of July parade until he was 104, which was spectacular. I think the last parade he marched in, the Suffolk Times took a picture of the two of us as we marched towards the American Legion. And that was the picture that the Suffolk Times gave me when they honored me with the Public Servant of the Year. Mm-hmm. And it was so perfectly fitting to have Dr. Pittman in that picture because he's an amazing servant and lived all the way to 104 years old.
Yes.
And it's just spectacular, and everybody loved him. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you another quick story just about his funeral. When I was at the funeral, his son John did a fantastic job during the ceremony. You go to funerals. I've been to a lot as a Legionnaire, and some can be quite downright depressing and dark. But John had this. He started off with this great story about he and his dad, and he made everybody laugh. And then we did our American Legion ceremony, and I had the opportunity to say something about Dr. Pittman. And it had been right during the time I was watching a documentary series on Netflix about Madoff. I don't know. Do you know who Madoff is?
The name rings a bell. I'm just...
Ponzi scheme Madoff?
Yes.
So this guy Madoff made off with a lot of money, other people's money, sadly. Destroyed his family's life. He had he had two lines of effort. One legitimate job, legitimate financial career, and one a nefarious financial career. Basically a Ponzi scheme. The legitimate one, in essence, were run by his two sons. And the illegitimate one was run by him and his cronies. So they were living the high life. They had homes in the Hamptons, homes in all over the place, tons of money. Well, Ponzi scheme, like every Ponzi scheme, it tumbles. When the market crashes and margins are called and the money's not there because you can't borrow from Peter to pay Paul, you're exposed. Well, his life was exposed, destroyed his sons' lives. One committed suicide, I think, and the other one died of a terrible health condition. So I'm at the funeral and it's dead quiet. And I said to everybody, "How many people have watched the Netflix series Madoff?" And they looked at me like, "What the hell are you doing, man? You're at a funeral." And I said, "No, there's a reason why I'm asking you this question." I go, have any of you watched that? Right now, we're in this church, packed. Every pew was. I mean, the thing was packed. People were outside of the vestibule. I think not. I don't know if you call it that. Well, the waiting area, yeah. I guess, whatever you call it. There were that many people there for the service, and I go, here's the difference between a life lived like a Madoff and a life lived like Dr. Pittman. And everybody understood what I meant because he filled the pews and everybody loved him, and it was a very positive thing. Where I think when Madoff died, it was probably in an empty casket, not only from the guy's soul, but from all the damage that he did to the people and who he wrecked and destroyed.
Definitely. No, thank you for sharing that. And then lastly, what are your hopes for the future of the North Fork and its community down the line? What would you hope to see?
I think it was there's a great my favorite movie is It's a Wonderful Life.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick Palamento, who's running for town board, I think he just wrote an op-ed or a piece for the Suffolk Times, where I think he titled it "It's a Wonderful Life," and he contrasts the two potential worlds. You could have Pottersville, or I forgot the name all of a sudden.
Let me check.
I forgot the name all of a sudden. It'll pop in my head. Everybody listening in the podcast going, I know what it is. I know what it is. Bedford Falls. So if you remember George Bailey, the main character, which it's kind of funny. Every year when I write my yearly goals, I say my goal is to emulate Charles Bailey, to have his character, because he was a flawed guy like everybody else. He had his issues. Obviously, he wanted to commit suicide. But then here he's given the blessing of being able to have an angel follow him and say, hey, here's your life. You can have a Pottersville, or you can have a Bedford Falls. And Nick was making that point. He's going, right now, we have the potential to have a Pottersville, or to have the Southold stay very much like it has been. What do we want? That really is my hope for the North Fork, that we can increase our population, but we don't decrease our humanity and our neighborliness.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like the quality of life.
Quality of life, and just like we don't want the, I'm honking my horns as I go out of IGA because I'm 5 seconds late going home to have my wine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I can wait for that old lady to take a couple more minutes to get out of IGA.
Yeah.
That's the North Fork that I've experienced, and I think I want the North Fork to mold the folks coming from the city, and not the city to mold the North Fork.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Definitely. No, that's something that I think people have touched on, and just making sure that it's not just they wanted their way of life in the city to be the same out here, without even understanding what the people who have been out here a while, the locals, what they think. And not everything has to be exactly how, or whatever services they want from in the city. What we have out here is unique, and that's what makes it special and what brings people out here.
No, I think you've hit it on the head. It reminds me of the analogy of the ugly American going over to other different countries, and demanding to have over easy eggs, during breakfast. And if there's anything I've learned by traveling in the military, especially going to another country with a Middle Eastern, with a Islamic background, and is you have to understand their culture and their religion. You have to understand what their lives are like. You can't go in there and expect everyone to see the world through your worldview.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
That's definitely something that my military service has taught me, and being on the North Fork has taught me.
Yes. And then just lastly, I'd like to ask people if there is anything else they'd like to say or discuss that we haven't talked about.
I guess what I would like to know is, how'd you come here, and what do you like about the North Fork?
I came here about 2.5 years ago from Portland, Maine, but I've kind of been all over the place. My parents are from Long Island, but I grew up in New Orleans.
Oh, that's Maine and New Orleans. Total contrast, man.
I know. And did high school in Texas.
Wow.
But only because with Hurricane Katrina, we had to evacuate, and we stayed with family up here. And then my parents got a job in Texas A&M. And then, I did art school for my bachelor's and then master's in fine arts. But then I decided to go for a master's in library science, and then did that during COVID, and then eventually was applying for jobs in the area. I was in Maine, and then happened to get the opportunity to work here, and then took on the role as the reference and local history librarian. But I think initially when I came out here, I was, because I had visited family I have family in East Mauritius and further west, but I hadn't been to the North Fork. I've been to the South Fork, but it was really interesting seeing the North Fork and just how open it was and the farmland. I didn't really even know that it was out here. I kind of was just thinking it would be another Hamptons in a way. What really was excited, and I think initially I was like, how would I adjust to a smaller town from being in Portland, Maine and New Orleans, but I feel really comfortable here and have enjoyed getting to know a lot of people within just the last 2 years, which is, I think, what's special about a smaller town area, that you get to know a lot of people, and I find it really nice.
How did you hear about this job? Was it like some sort of national advertisement that went out, or?
Trying to think. I think there was a Long Island Library Resource Council job listing site. I think there's one for every state where I was looking: Maine, Massachusetts. But I was like, oh, this would be interesting out on the east end of Long Island on the North Fork.
So are you living? Here's the real estate question, because this job is not it's not paying a lot, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So how are you able to afford it? How are you able to make it work out here?
Well,
it's hard to get good talent to take these positions, and that's, just really quickly tying it to the assessors and these other jobs.
Mm-hmm.
They don't pay a lot. So it's like, how are you doing it?
When I started looking, it was really, I was like, there's not much available for rent. And I was like, I don't know how I'm going to be able to afford any type of one bedroom or studio with my salary. But I was able to find a one bedroom apartment that was pretty well priced, and I was able to move into something a little bit smaller that I was able to get a lower rent, so that I do have some money left over. But it still can be a challenge.
It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
That's one thing that's really tough about the North Fork. Everyone talks, affordable housing. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the affordable housing, when it's tied with government money, for example, if they want to build a big apartment complex and it's tied with government money, you cannot discriminate, meaning you cannot discriminate locality.
Yes.
So you can't be a high priority for, even though you live here and work here, it's got to be open to anybody, anywhere.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate, because you can have a complex that is built and then everybody's living and going out west and working out west. That's what stinks. It'd be great if you have private money and they're able to build some sort of affordable housing or affordable apartments where it's private money. Then you have that ability to choose individuals that are working local.
And I was looking at Vineyard View. But
a lottery.
That's a lottery, but then I didn't even fit the bracket. I think I was just slightly above, so I wouldn't qualify. So it's kind of like you're stuck in that middle where you're kind of left out. But it's a challenge. I don't know.
No, it's been really good talking to you. I think you have a great disposition for the North Fork in terms of your manner and how you speak.
Yes.
You don't have that New York drive.
No.
That's not the way to say it. The ugly New York drive.
Yes. No, I try to come to the area and listen and talk with the people that have grown up here, and not coming in here and, like you said, with that kind of, I don't know if it's more of like an aggressive, like, let's do this, we got to change, and all this has to change, and where I'm like, let's learn from the locals and hear their stories and what it was like out here and what's important to them.
Yeah.
No,
it's been a great talk.
I don't want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast and share your story. And thank you for your work with the town, and thank you for your service.
No, I really appreciate that.
So I hope you enjoyed episode 118 with Lieutenant Colonel Charles Sanders. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.